The inheritance of fate. Alan Bell sat in the cockpit of his patrol ship, a seasoned veteran of the Galactic Federation's peacekeeping forces. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant companion, a sound that had grown familiar over the years as he patrolled the edges of human space, ensuring peace was maintained across the stars. Today, however, the rhythm of routine was shattered by a sudden chirp from his communication device. His fingers hovered over the console, and with a sigh, he tapped the screen. The message was a surprise, a call to the Federation's central hub. Alan's brow furrowed as the message loaded. He expected routine updates or mission parameters, but what he received was nothing short of extraordinary. It was a legal notification, and his name appeared at the top of the document as the designated beneficiary of an inheritance. But this was no ordinary bequest. The message detailed the inheritance of a woman, a slave girl from the Orion Empire, a stunning being named Hera. Alan's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any inheritance. It was a gift from Zarok, an Orion merchant he had once saved from pirate raiders in a battle long forgotten. The message was simple but jarring. Alan had inherited Hera, an alien woman bound by the customs of her people, and now she was his responsibility. A sense of disbelief washed over Alan. He had never asked for this. He had never known this woman, and now he was being thrust into a situation he didn't fully understand. The Federation officer's words echoed in his mind. "If you refuse, she will be auctioned off to another slaver." The words stung. Slavery, a practice that still persisted in parts of the galaxy, was something Alan had always opposed. His sense of justice screamed against it, but here he was, presented with an impossible choice. Hera's life, her future, was now entwined with his. Could he refuse, knowing she would be sold to someone else, someone who might not care about her as a person? Or would he take responsibility for her, regardless of his personal misgivings about ownership? As the news settled in, Alan set a course for the Federation's central station. His mind raced with questions. What would happen now? Was this a trap? How was he supposed to handle this situation? What did it mean to inherit someone like Hera? The enormity of it weighed heavily on him as his ship made its way toward the bustling, sterile corridors of the station. The Federation's central hub was a place of order, of laws and regulations. Alan had been there before, but this time it felt different. His footsteps echoed as he was escorted to a quiet office where an officer waited, her face a mask of professional detachment. She slid a datapad across the desk, the message now official. The legal papers were there, confirming his inheritance, but the officer's tone was dry and emotionless. "Congratulations, Sergeant Bell. You are now the legal owner of Hera, a slave of the Orion people. Her transfer will take place under Federation protocols." Alan's stomach churned. How could this be happening? How could he, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others, now find himself in such a morally complex situation? He thought of the Federation's strict codes, the way they balanced law and ethics, but this felt wrong on so many levels. Yet there was no escaping it. Refuse the inheritance, and Hera's fate would be even darker. The officer's cold words made it clear. His refusal would sentence her to a life of further suffering. "I accept," Alan said, the words heavy on his tongue. The officer nodded, as though it was a routine transaction. She handed him the legal documents and a data chip containing the necessary information to navigate the customs and laws of the Orion Empire. As the documents were handed over, Alan felt a strange unease settle over him. He was now responsible for a sentient being, a woman with her own thoughts, emotions, and dreams. He had no idea what her life had been like, but the reality of ownership struck him hard. Hera wasn't a piece of property. She was a person, and now she was his. Alan left the office, a storm of emotions churning in his chest. He made his way to the docking bay, where Hera awaited him. She stood there, her striking figure framed by the harsh lights of the station. She had green skin, her dark hair flowing like liquid silk around her shoulders. Her eyes, a mixture of gold and emerald, met his with an intensity that was both captivating and unsettling. It was as though she was assessing him. And for the first time, Alan realized just how little he knew about her, or about what he was stepping into. Hera said nothing, her gaze steady and calm. Alan's voice caught in his throat as he tried to speak. What could he say? What should he say? "We should go," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. The shuttle that would carry them to his military base hummed as the door slid open, and they both stepped inside. The reality of the situation hit him hard. He was now responsible for her life, for her well-being, and yet he had no idea what the future held. The shuttle lifted off, and Alan stole a glance at Hera. She was a mystery, her emotions hidden beneath the calm exterior. Alan couldn't help but feel a pull toward her, a strange combination of attraction and guilt. He had inherited a woman, a person, whose life was forever linked to his now. Would he be able to do the right thing? Could he protect her from the dangers of their galaxy, or would he fail her as so many had failed others? As the shuttle broke through the atmosphere, Alan glanced back at the station. His life had just taken a turn into the unknown, and there was no going back now. Whatever lay ahead, whatever obstacles or choices would come, he would have to face them with Hera by his side. But little did he know, the inheritance would soon lead them into a much larger conflict, one that would shake the foundations of interstellar relations. The inheritance of Hera was just the beginning, and the story of Alan Bell and his newfound responsibility was only just beginning to unfold. The weight of ownership. As the shuttle soared through the stars, Alan Bell couldn't shake the weight of the legal documents that rested in his hands. The stark reality of his inheritance, Hera, settled deep in his bones. She sat quietly beside him, her presence like a silent storm. Alan couldn't help but steal occasional glances at her, trying to understand the enigma that was the Orion slave girl. Her striking green skin shimmered faintly under the cabin lights, and her golden green eyes seemed to hold 1,000 secrets, all locked behind a calm exterior. Despite the fact that they were in space, gliding past stars and planets, Alan felt a growing sense of isolation. The universe, once a vast and exhilarating place, now seemed too small, as if the very walls of the shuttle were closing in around him. He thought back to his military training, the countless hours spent preparing for combat, for peacekeeping, for the struggles of war. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him to be the owner of another life, let alone someone like Hera. The shuttle's engines hummed, a constant reminder of the journey ahead. Alan was taking Hera to a military base on the Outer Rim, a place known for its strategic importance rather than its compassion. It was an outpost where soldiers trained and fought, not a place where sensitive matters like slavery were dealt with. It seemed wrong to bring someone like Hera into that harsh, regimented world, but he had no choice. The paperwork was clear. Her future was in his hands. "Can you understand me?" Alan finally asked, breaking the silence that had hung between them. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, uncertain. Hera turned her gaze to him, her eyes meeting his in a way that felt almost too intimate. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the two of them locked in a silent exchange. Then, with a slight nod, she answered, "Some." Alan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." They were able to communicate, at least on a basic level, and that was a small relief in a sea of uncertainty. He paused, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat, a nervous energy building inside him. "What happened to you? How did you end up like this?" Alan didn't know why he asked. Perhaps it was the natural instinct to understand the person now bound to him by law, or perhaps it was simply the need to feel some sense of connection in an otherwise cold situation. Hera's eyes softened at his question, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze out the window, watching the stars streak by. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice low, measured. "I was born into this life. Slavery is all I know," she said. "Zirak, he was my owner. But he was kind. There was a faint sadness in her voice, the first crack in her otherwise stoic demeanor. "He was the only one who ever showed me kindness." Alan's chest tightened at her words. How could a man who owned another be kind? How could he treat someone as property with any shred of decency? Alan didn't know, and he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. All he knew was that Hera's fate now rested on him, and that burden felt heavier with every passing moment. The shuttle ride was quiet for the rest of the journey. Alan stared at the stars outside, his mind racing with the implications of his new reality. Hera was more than just a slave. She was a person with thoughts, feelings, a history. Yet, according to Orion law, she was his property, no different from a machine or a tool. Alan couldn't reconcile the contradiction. How could he treat her as property when she was clearly so much more? The shuttle began its descent toward the military base. Alan's stomach twisted as they neared the tarmac, the sprawling complex below coming into view. It was a fortress, cold, imposing, and impersonal. He couldn't help but wonder what Hera would think of it. What would she feel when she saw this place, a world built for soldiers and war? This wasn't the kind of life he had envisioned for her, but he didn't know what else to do. He couldn't simply release her into the wilds of the galaxy. The Federation would never allow that. "Welcome to Gamma Base," Alan muttered under his breath as the shuttle landed with a slight jolt. The landing gear touched down, and the shuttle came to a stop. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the doors opened, and the harsh, sterile air of the base filled the cabin. "Get your gear," Alan said, his voice brisk. "We need to get you settled in." Hera didn't move at first. She looked out the shuttle window, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she stood, her movements fluid and graceful. There was a strange calm about her, an almost resigned acceptance of the situation, though Alan knew better than to assume she was fine with it. He didn't know how to help her, or even how to treat her. He had inherited a slave, not a partner, not a friend. But as they stepped off the shuttle and onto the cold tarmac of Gamma Base, Alan realized something. This wasn't just about ownership. This was about protection. It had to be. And it was then, in that moment of uncertainty, that Alan made a promise to himself. He would protect Hera, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. He wasn't sure how he was going to make it work, or what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her become just another casualty of the universe's cruel indifference. As the base's personnel began to move toward them, Alan looked at Hera, silently making a vow to her. She wasn't just an inheritance. She wasn't just a slave. She was a person, and he would find a way to help her find freedom, no matter the cost. Little did they know, their arrival at Gamma Base was only the beginning of a much larger conflict, a conflict that would test both their resolve and their very place in the galaxy. A dangerous alliance. Gamma Base loomed ahead, its towering spires cutting through the thin atmosphere like cold, metallic fingers. Alan Bell's boots thudded against the tarmac as he led Hera through the base's entrance, his mind swirling with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. The base wasn't what he had hoped for. Its sterile, utilitarian architecture felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. But it was his duty now to keep Hera safe, at least for as long as he could. As they walked, the men and women in uniform barely spared them a glance. Soldiers were focused on their duties, their eyes locked on screens or instruments, more interested in the numbers and reports of war than the lives they were responsible for. Alan had always been one of them. His job had always been about defending humanity, about keeping the peace. But now it felt different. Now his responsibility stretched far beyond his fellow soldiers. Now his mission was to protect an innocent, to shield her from a galaxy that had treated her like nothing more than property. "We'll need to get you acclimated to Federation rules," Alan said, his voice distant as they passed through the base's security checkpoint. "The base commander will have a room for you and we'll—" Acclimated. Hera's voice cut through the air, her words filled with quiet intensity. She looked at him, her golden green eyes searching his face, as if trying to read the true meaning behind his words. "I don't need Federation rules, Alan Bell. I need freedom." Alan froze, his words catching in his throat. She had a point. Freedom. The word was foreign to him when it came to her. He had inherited a person, not a possession. Yet, all he had done so far was shuffle her from one cage to another, from the laws of the Orion Empire to the rules of the Federation. She wasn't free, not in any sense of the word. But what did freedom look like for someone like her? Hera had known nothing but slavery. Could someone like her ever truly be free? Or had she been so conditioned by her past that the concept itself seemed like a distant dream? Before he could answer, a voice called out from behind them, dragging Alan from his thoughts. "Sergeant Bell." The voice was sharp, commanding. Alan turned to find his commanding officer, Colonel Harper, approaching with brisk steps. Harper was a tall man with a hardened face, his sharp features carved by years of military service. His uniform was immaculate, as always. "Sir," Alan said, snapping a quick salute. Harper's gaze flickered to Hera, then back to Alan. "I've been briefed about your inheritance. This is a delicate matter, Sergeant. We'll have to follow protocol, of course, but you need to understand that this situation could escalate quickly. Orion extremists are not known for their patience." Alan's heart skipped a beat. He had feared this. News of his inheritance had likely already spread like wildfire through the galaxy. The Orion Empire took their slave systems seriously. Any deviation from the norm, especially an Orion slave being transferred to a human, could spark conflict. And if extremists were involved, well, things could get ugly fast. "I understand, sir," Alan replied. "But I will do what I can to ensure there are no issues. Hera is not just some property. She's a person, and I intend to treat her as such." Harper's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "You might be well-meaning, Sergeant, but this isn't about feelings. It's about intergalactic law. You need to be prepared for what might come next. The Federation and the Orion Empire don't exactly see eye to eye on these matters." Alan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't backing down. He'd already made up his mind. "I'll take full responsibility, sir," Alan said firmly. "I'll make sure Hera stays safe." Harper studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. I'm assigning you a new post, Sergeant. You'll be tasked with overseeing her care and security. But remember, this could get complicated. You've already made enemies just by accepting her." Alan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew the stakes. He had no illusions about how dangerous things could get, but he also knew that Hera needed him. With a curt nod, Colonel Harper turned and walked away, leaving Alan standing in the cold, sterile hallway with Hera. The tension between them was palpable. Hera had remained quiet during the exchange, her eyes following Harper's every move, as though she were sizing up the situation, gauging how much power the humans had over her now. Alan didn't blame her. He was essentially her owner in the eyes of the Federation, and Hera had no reason to trust him, especially given the situation. "We should get you settled," Alan said, trying to keep his voice calm. Hera said nothing, but the tension in her body spoke volumes. She was trying to keep her composure, but Alan could see the flicker of frustration and fear in her eyes. As they walked toward the barracks, Alan's thoughts raced. The military base was a place of order and control, but it was also a place of danger. The extremists, the Orion rebels, had been known to target Federation outposts, particularly those with sensitive situations like Alan's. Hera was not just a symbol of ownership. She was a target. To some, she represented a betrayal of their laws, their culture. To others, she was a prize to be claimed. "Alan," Hera's voice was soft, but there was something sharp in it. "Do you know what you've done? You've brought me into the heart of their military base. They'll come for me, you know." Alan stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He had been trying to ignore the growing threat. But Hera was right. She had no reason to trust him, and everything around them was starting to feel like it was closing in. The galaxy had no place for someone like her, someone who had been born into slavery, yet held so much power in her spirit. "I know," Alan said, his voice low, "but I'm going to protect you. I won't let them take you." As the words left his mouth, Alan knew they would be tested. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the fight for Hera's freedom had only just begun. Little did Alan know, forces far beyond his control were already closing in, and the true cost of protecting Hera was about to become far more than he ever anticipated. The flame of rebellion. Days passed quickly at Gamma Base. Alan Bell found himself caught in a whirlwind of training schedules, security briefings, and mundane military tasks. But amidst the routine, there was an ever-present tension, a quiet, unspoken awareness that things were about to change. And then there was Hera, the reason he felt like his world was slowly being consumed by a fire he couldn't control. She was different, not just because of her beauty, though her striking features, the green skin that shimmered like polished jade, and the golden green eyes that seemed to pierce through him were impossible to ignore. No, it was more than that. There was a quiet fire within her, a strength that made her seem untouchable despite her status as his property. Alan had thought the situation would be straightforward. He'd keep her safe, deal with the legalities, and move on. But it was clear now that things were far more complicated than he could have imagined. Hera had adapted quickly to the rigid military environment. She learned the Federation's basic protocols and navigated the base with a quiet grace. But there was a stubbornness in her, a refusal to be subjugated, that Alan could see more clearly with every passing day. She never spoke of her past in detail, but Alan sensed the weight of it in her every gesture, every glance. One evening, as Alan was finishing up his shift, he found himself standing at the base's observation deck, staring out at the endless expanse of space. The stars seemed so distant, so unreachable. He thought about the world he had once known, the sense of duty and purpose that had guided him for years. Now, standing here, everything felt uncertain. Hera's presence haunted him, not just because of the legal implications, but because of the feelings he couldn't quite understand. "You seem distant, Sergeant." Hera's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and steady, as always. She had appeared beside him without a sound, her movements silent and graceful. Alan turned to find her standing there, her gaze fixed on the stars as well. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm just thinking," Alan replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "about everything that's happening, and everything that could happen. I didn't sign up for this, Hera. I didn't ask for this responsibility. I didn't ask for my life either," Hera said, her words cutting through the air with an edge of bitterness. "But here we are. It's just the way things are. Slavery isn't a choice for anyone, whether it's the slaver or the slave." Alan's chest tightened at her words. He couldn't argue with her. He hadn't chosen this, and neither had she. But for the first time since the inheritance, he realized how little he knew about the woman who was now under his care. How had she survived? What had she endured? There was so much pain behind those eyes, so much defiance in the way she held herself. "You're not a slave here," Alan said, his voice firm, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. She glanced at him, her gaze soft but resolute. "Not yet, maybe. But there are always chains, whether they're physical or invisible. Chains always find their way back." Before Alan could respond, a loud alarm blared through the base, cutting through the tense silence. Red warning lights flickered on the observation deck, casting an eerie glow over the room. A cold shiver ran down Alan's spine as a voice crackled over the loudspeakers. "Attention all personnel. Unidentified ships approaching. Possible hostile activity. All units prepare for immediate deployment. I repeat, all units prepare for immediate deployment." Alan's heart rate spiked. This was no drill. The situation was real. He turned to Hera, his mind racing. The base's defenses were strong, but it wouldn't take much for someone with the right resources to breach their perimeter. Could this be the Orion extremists? They had been watching him ever since the news of Hera's inheritance broke. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. "We need to get to the command center," Alan said urgently, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the nearest exit. Hera didn't resist. She moved swiftly, her steps light and deliberate. But Alan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something bigger was unfolding, something that went beyond just an attack on a Federation base. As they raced through the halls, Alan's mind worked overtime. Who was behind the attack? Was it the extremists who saw Hera as a symbol of human betrayal? Or was it something else, something more dangerous? When they arrived at the command center, the room was filled with the usual chaos of an imminent crisis. Officers shouted orders, technicians worked furiously at their stations, and the cold blue glow of screens bathed the room in an artificial light. "Sergeant Bell." Colonel Harper's voice rang out over the noise. He was standing near a tactical display, his face taut with concentration. Alan rushed over, and Hera followed silently behind him, as if sensing the tension in the room. "Sir, what's going on?" Alan asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic within him. "It's the Orion extremists," Harper replied, his tone grim. "They've launched a full assault on the base. They're after you, Bell. And they're after Hera. We're in the middle of a war now, whether we like it or not." Alan's blood ran cold. He had feared this moment. The extremists had been watching, waiting for an excuse to act. And now, it seemed, they had found it. The war between the Federation and the Orion Empire was about to escalate, and it all centered around him. And the woman he had inherited. "Do we have any way of defending ourselves?" Alan asked, trying to focus through the chaos. "We're launching our interceptors, but it's not enough," Harper replied. "The extremists have a well-coordinated strike force. We're facing a full-scale attack." Alan's mind raced. He had to protect Hera, not just from the extremists, but from the chaos that was sure to follow. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about standing up for what was right, about protecting a life that had been thrown away by the cruel realities of the galaxy. "Get to the armory," Alan said to Hera, his voice sharp. "Stay there. I'll make sure you're safe." "No," Hera replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not hiding. If they come for us, I'll fight too. You don't get to protect me by running." Her words hit Alan harder than any explosion could have. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a slave. Hera had fire in her, a will to survive, a determination that burned brightly, even in the face of death. And in that moment, Alan knew that their fight had just begun. The war for freedom, for their lives, for the future, was starting right now. And they would fight together. The breaking point. The storm of chaos outside the command center escalated as Alan Bell paced the room, the weight of the situation sinking deeper with each passing minute. The loud hum of alarms filled the air, mingling with the voices of officers shouting commands and the frantic tapping of keyboards. The base had always been prepared for an attack, but this was different. The sheer ferocity of the Orion extremists was unlike anything they had faced before. "Sergeant Bell." Colonel Harper's voice cut through the noise, snapping Alan back to attention. "We've identified their lead ship. It's a battleship, heavily armed, with a fleet of smaller interceptors backing it up. They've been planning this for a while." Alan clenched his fists, his thoughts flashing back to the quiet moments he had shared with Hera over the past few days. The attack wasn't just about the Federation, or even the Orion Empire. It was about Hera. The extremists were targeting her, and now he was responsible for her safety in the most dangerous way possible. Hera stood beside him, her green skin pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the command center. Her eyes, however, were sharp with focus. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The fire inside her had only grown since the day she had been taken from her home and thrust into this chaotic world. Alan had seen that fire before, when she had spoken about freedom, when she had refused to accept her status as merely a possession. "You can't protect me by hiding, Alan," she had told him, her voice quiet but resolute. "I won't be the damsel in distress. I won't be a victim anymore." Her words echoed in Alan's mind as the threat from the extremists grew closer. She had made up her mind. She wouldn't sit idly by while the galaxy tried to rip her life apart. "Alan, we need to prepare." Hera spoke again, her voice steady as ever. She was more than ready for the fight ahead. The stoic mask she wore made it impossible to tell how much fear lay beneath the surface, but Alan could feel the tremors in her every movement. She was afraid, but she wouldn't show it. That was her strength. "We don't have much time," Alan muttered, glancing at the tactical screen where the incoming fleet was fast approaching. His mind was moving at 100 miles per hour. The situation was dire, and he needed to act fast. He grabbed a blaster rifle from the weapons rack, and Hera followed suit, her movements swift and purposeful. She had trained with weapons before, had been forced to learn how to defend herself in a world that viewed her as little more than an object to be used. The skill in her movements didn't surprise Alan. He had seen glimpses of her strength, her resilience, in their short time together. But now he saw it for what it truly was. Hera wasn't just a woman to protect. She was an ally, a warrior in her own right. As the two of them ran through the base's corridors, Alan's thoughts raced. The base was well equipped, with walls reinforced against attack, but the sheer firepower of the extremists was unmatched. They were being overwhelmed. The base's interceptors had engaged the Orient fleet, but there were just too many ships closing in. Alan knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "Alan, what's the plan?" Hera asked, her voice sharp as they approached the armory's control panel. Alan's pulse quickened as he punched in the access code. "Plan," he repeated, his words a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "We fight." Before he could continue, the doors to the armory slid open, revealing a stockpile of weapons. Alan grabbed an energy rifle, handing it to Hera as he equipped himself with a blaster pistol. They couldn't afford to waste time. The attack was happening right now. The extremists were coming for them. "There's a holdout position on the eastern side of the base," Alan said quickly, checking the map on his wristpad. "We can reinforce it and buy ourselves some time. That's our best shot at stopping the assault." As they made their way through the maze of hallways, the sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the base. Soldiers raced past them, heading toward the front lines, while others scrambled to protect key points. Alan's mind was consumed with one thought: Hera's safety. He had no illusions about the danger they were facing. The extremists would stop at nothing to capture her, and if they couldn't get her alive, they would make sure she was silenced forever. The base was a battleground. It always had been, but now it was a battleground with something more at stake: Hera's freedom. Alan had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a soldier, trained to follow orders, to protect and serve. But now he was forced to become something more. "Stay close," Alan ordered as they neared the eastern defenses. Hera nodded without hesitation, her eyes steely and determined. There was no fear in her now. The fire she carried within her was the only thing Alan needed to focus on as they moved forward. When they reached the defense line, they were met with a scene of chaos. Federation soldiers fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. The extremists were ruthless, their ships dropping soldiers onto the base with terrifying efficiency. The ground shook as explosions rang out in the distance, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the sky. Alan took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. This was it. The moment of truth. The line had been drawn, and there was no going back. As they charged forward, Hera by his side, Alan felt the weight of their situation like a weight pressing down on his chest. They weren't just fighting to defend a base. They were fighting for something more. They were fighting for a future where Hera could be free, where humanity could stand side by side with the other species of the galaxy, no longer weighed down by the chains of slavery and oppression. The first wave of extremists hit hard. Federation soldiers were scattered, struggling to keep their ground. Alan's blaster rifle roared to life, and he watched as enemy soldiers fell one by one. Hera was at his side, her movements fluid and precise as she picked off targets with deadly accuracy. They were a team, forged in the fires of battle and necessity. But as the enemy continued to push forward, Alan realized that this fight was far from over. The extremists would keep coming, and the true cost of protecting Hera, the true cost of freedom, was only just beginning to reveal itself. The battle raged on, and in the heart of it, Alan knew one thing for certain. He would never stop fighting for her, not as her owner, but as her ally, her protector, and maybe, just maybe, her friend. Into the heart of darkness. The deafening noise of explosions echoed through the halls of Gamma Base, mingling with the frantic voices of soldiers and technicians who scrambled to keep their ground. Alan Bell and Hera pushed through the chaos, moving with purpose, their weapons held firm as they defended their position from the relentless assault of the Orion extremists. The base, once a symbol of peace and order, had become a battlefield. And in the midst of it all, Alan knew they were racing against time. "Stay sharp," Alan grunted as he ducked behind a reinforced pillar, narrowly avoiding an incoming blast that rocked the walls. Hera moved with fluid grace beside him, her eyes scanning the battlefield, her pulse steady despite the chaos. She was like a shadow, striking with precision and efficiency. Alan was beginning to understand just how dangerous she was, not just to their enemies, but to anyone who underestimated her strength. She was a force to be reckoned with, and in this moment, Alan realized that the war wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about fighting alongside her, for a future neither of them had ever imagined. "We're losing ground," one of the Federation soldiers yelled as he crouched beside them, eyes wide with panic. "The extremists are everywhere. They've breached the east side. We can't let them take the control center," Alan said through gritted teeth. "Hold your position. We'll reinforce the line." He turned to Hera, whose face remained unreadable, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was no longer the frightened, confused slave girl from the Orion Empire. She was a soldier now, just like him, and her presence beside him was the most powerful weapon they had. "I'll cover you," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. Alan nodded, his hand tightening around his blaster rifle. They didn't have time for hesitation. Every second counted. The extremists had pushed through their defenses faster than anticipated, and now they were making their final push for the heart of the base. Alan knew that if they failed to protect the central command, the base would fall. And if that happened, the consequences for Hera would be devastating. They moved forward together, the heat of battle closing in on them as they advanced toward the central hub. The air was thick with smoke, and the once pristine hallways of Gamma Base were now scarred with blaster marks and debris. Alan's mind raced as he assessed their strategy. The extremists weren't just after the base. They were after something more. Hera, the political implications of her inheritance, had ignited a firestorm across the galaxy, and the extremists saw her as a symbol of defiance. She was their target, and as long as she was here, she was at risk. "Alan, look out," Hera shouted, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Alan snapped back to the present just in time to see an Orion soldier take aim from a corner ahead. Before he could react, Hera was already in motion, her rifle raised. A single shot rang out, and the enemy soldier collapsed to the floor. Her movements were seamless, her instincts razor-sharp. She was an extension of the chaos surrounding them, a deadly force in a world built for war. "Nice shot," Alan muttered, catching his breath. He had always been a good soldier, but there was something about Hera's presence that made him feel almost inadequate in comparison. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess herself. She just acted. "Let's keep moving," Hera said, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. They continued forward, Every corner they turned bringing them closer to the heart of the conflict. Alan's mind was consumed with one thought: protect Hera. Nothing else mattered. He couldn't afford to lose her, not when they were this close to winning. Not when they had fought this hard. As they neared the command center, the sounds of battle grew louder. The Federation's defenses were beginning to crack under the pressure. Alan knew they didn't have much time. They needed to get to the control center, activate the base's lockdown procedures, and seal off any further reinforcements from the extremists. It was their only hope of keeping the base secure. But as they rounded the final corner, they were met with a sight that made Alan's blood run cold. Standing before them, blocking the entrance to the control center, was a group of Orion extremists, well armed, their faces hidden behind dark masks. They had been waiting for them. Well, one of the extremists said, his voice low and gravelly. It seems we've caught ourselves a prize. Alan instinctively stepped in front of Hera, his blaster rifle raised. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no room for hesitation now. They were outnumbered, but Alan wasn't about to back down. Not now. I don't want to fight you, Alan said, his voice calm but firm. But I will if I have to. Step aside.